Acha ji. So now that I'm unmuted, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to all of you. Today we start with the pharyngeal apparatus. In other words, we are doing the development of head and neck. Since you are doing the head and neck region, so I thought, okay, let the two systems coincide. Okay, 80 basically we're doing the same system. So this is just repetition from what you did in first year. This is the neural tube. This is the cranial end of the neural tube. As the neural tube thickens, as it grows, it bulges further into this is the amniotic cavity. So the neural tube bulges into the amniotic cavity. And then you also know that the pharynx is the cranial most part of the foregut. Foregut and pharynx and then esophagus. These two are the most cranial parts, starting from the pharynx, which is the cranial most part of the foregut is the pharynx. So we were talking about the neural tube. The neural tube, the cranial end, develops into brain, and as head fold occurs, this developing brain overhangs the developing heart. Okay. Between the developing brain over here and the developing heart, you have the structure which is the oropharyngeal membrane. And I hope you remember that oropharyngeal membrane is a structure which is a bilaminar structure where the ectoderm and endoderm they fuse. There is no mesoderm in between. For the developing embryo, you have two areas where ectoderm and endoderm fuse with each other with no intervening mesoderm. एक ये oropharyngeal membrane में और caudal end पे you had the cloaca where the ectoderm and endoderm were meeting. Over here you had the cloaca, and this is the oropharyngeal membrane. अच्छा जी. So you know very well that as the head fold occurs, as this part of the embryo folds forwards, इसको हम head fold कहते हैं, part of the endoderm, अब यहाँ पे सारी yolk sac थी, ठीक है? So, with the head fold, part of the endoderm of the yolk sac, this is incorporated into the embryo. When it is incorporated in the embryo, it develops into foregut. So आप ये देख लीजिए, the foregut over here is lying between the developing brain and the developing heart. और ये जो, this is the stomodium, the developing mouth. And this oropharyngeal membrane separates the stomodium from the foregut, the cranial part of the foregut. और अभी हमने कहा था that the cranial part of the foregut is the pharynx. Stomodium is the developing mouth. So when this oropharyngeal membrane will rupture, the mouth will come in contact with the pharynx. Actually, in this picture, you can see that the brain and the developing heart, they are separated from each other by this structure, which is the oropharyngeal membrane. This is the stomodium, and this is the cranial most part of the foregut, which is the pharynx. So neck is developed when this part is, number one, the pharyngeal arch is developed. Number two, the heart descends, grows in this direction. Then this part would elongate and develop into the neck. So this area between the brain and the heart, this increases in length because the heart descends and the pharyngeal arches are formed. Acha ji, before we go any further, let's discuss one thing. Then, what are the sources of development of head and neck? How will the head and neck develop? The sources, if I enumerate them, you have paraxial mesoderm, lateral plate mesoderm, neural crest cells, and ectodermal placodes. I repeat once again, it is paraxial mesoderm, lateral plate mesoderm, neural crest cells, and ectodermal placodes. Paraxial mesoderm, you all know, intraembryonic mesoderm got divided into three. From medial to lateral, it was paraxial mesoderm, intermediate mesoderm, and lateral plate mesoderm. Intermediate mesoderm, you remember very well, I hope. Intermediate mesoderm developed into urogenital system. Okay. Paraxial mesoderm के different derivatives थे जिनमें से एक somites थे और somites की development we've already done. Now, contribution of the paraxial mesoderm to the head and neck. उसमें if you remember हमने किया था parts of the skull developed from paraxial mesoderm. Then certain voluntary muscles in the craniofacial region, that is part of the head. Unke muscles there, they develop from the, and then of course the connective tissue, dermis, and even part of the meninges, dura, they develop from paraxial mesoderm. Okay? So parts of the skull, some few voluntary muscles of the head basically, and dermis and connective tissue, plus the meninges in this air region. Meninges में dura होता है, वो भी we'll do a little later. Then comes lateral plate mesoderm. Lateral plate mesoderm contributes specifically to the development of the cartilages of the larynx and plus the connective tissue in this region. So larynx के region में the connective tissue plus the cartilages of the larynx, all these develop from lateral plate mesoderm. Then neural crest cells. Neural crest cells we've already discussed in detail that they give a major contribution to the pharyngeal arches. It can mesenchyme and develop from neural crest cells. This mesenchyme then develops into the skeletal structures in the developing pharyngeal arches. अभी हम इसको in detail करते हैं. This is a major contribution. Neural crest cells play a major role in the development of the pharyngeal arches. And of course, the ectodermal placodes and made neurons in 5th, 7th, 9th, and 10th cranial nerve के जो ganglia हैं, plus olfactory epithelium, plus the lens. Lens also develops from placodes, ectodermal placodes. ये हम इंशाल्लाह in detail करेंगे. Since lens and the eye, etc., this is part of the head and neck. Even though ये sensory आपका special senses में है, but they form part of the head and neck. So I thought कि आपको इसका पता होना चाहिए. अच्छा जी, pharyngeal arches की बात करते हैं. What exactly are the pharyngeal arches? Beta, this is the developing pharynx, the cranial most part of the foregut. ये tube जो है. अब this is basically formed, as we discussed earlier, by foregut है ना, so it is formed by incorporation of the cranial most part of the yolk sac. Part of the yolk sac, head fold की वजह से the yolk sac gets incorporated into the body wall of the embryo. This part of the yolk sac then develops into foregut, and the most cranial part of the foregut is the pharynx. So ये developing pharynx है. This pharynx obviously is made up of endoderm, क्योंकि yolk sac endoderm से बनी हुई थी. So this is all endoderm. Outside the endoderm is mesoderm, mesenchyme. So this entire tube all around is surrounded by mesenchyme, and still outside over here, ये सारी mesenchyme है, ठीक है? And still outside you have ectoderm. So this is endoderm, the pharynx. Innermost layer is the endoderm. Then comes this mesenchyme, the brown, and this black line is the ectoderm surrounding the developing pharynx. Okay. Now, this mesoderm surrounding the pharynx. Now, this is arranged in the form of 6 bars. जिस तरह bars of chocolate होते हैं ना, rods कह लें, 6 rods कह लें. अब वो rods कैसे arranged हैं? वो arranged हैं from posterior to anterior. Anteriorly, these rods meet with each other. अब if you spread your fingers, तो जो आपकी फिंगर्स फैला लें और खोल लें अपने फिंगर्स को, आपकी फिंगर्स जो हैं, दोनों हाथ की फिंगर्स, let them meet in front of you. ठीक है? अब आपकी फिंगर्स जो हैं, ये कंडेंस्ड mesenchyme है, और आपकी फिंगर्स के दरमियान जो गैप है वो लूज mesenchyme है. सो ये जो कंडेंस्ड mesenchyme है, ये 6 pharyngeal arches है. अब आप ये देख लीजिए कि ये जो bars of mesenchyme है, या ये जो rods of condensed mesenchyme है, they are on the side wall, around the side wall of the developing foregut, cranial part of the foregut या pharynx. ठीक है, ये pharynx का उन्होंने ventral wall बनाई हुई है, ये side walls है. And this would be the posterior wall. So ये bars इस तरह surround कर रही हैं pharynx को. Anteriorly ये इस side की bar और इस side की bar, they would come and meet in the center, in the midline. ये जो bars of mesenchyme and that come and meet in the midline, in the center, they are called pharyngeal arches. ये देख लीजिए, यहाँ पे दिखा दूं, ये bars हैं, they come forward side wall of the pharynx, they come and meet in the midline. ये 1, second arch, third arch, ठीक है, and so on. अच्छा जी, आगे चलते हैं. Still continuing with the pharyngeal apparatus. अब मैंने आपसे कहा था कि in between your fingers you have gaps. तो आप ये imagine करें, ये आपकी fingers जो हैं, they are condensed mesenchyme. They are the pharyngeal arch. In between जो gap between your fingers जो है, this is loose mesenchyme. अब ये mesenchyme चाहे वो condensed mesenchyme, इधर देख लीजिए, this is one bar, this is the other bar, right and left side. First bar ये है, ठीक है? So this is the first arch. This would be the condensed mesenchyme, but in between ये जो है, this is loose mesenchyme. अब चाहे वो condensed mesenchyme हो या loose mesenchyme हो, it is lined on the inside by endoderm. It is lined on the outside by ectoderm. So, अब ये जो loose mesenchyme है, since yeah, condensed mesenchyme तो अपनी जगह, it will stay as it is. But where you have the loose mesenchyme in between 2 bars of condensed mesenchyme, you have loose mesenchyme. Please look at your finger. You have fingers. You have loose mesenchyme in between the condensed mesenchyme. So where you have loose mesenchyme, this endoderm, this bulges out, and this structure, this endoderm bulges outwards, and this structure that is formed by the bulging out of endoderm is called a pharyngeal pouch. Okay? On the outside, you have ectoderm, and this is loose mesenchyme. Ectoderm, where at the site of loose mesenchyme, the ectoderm bulges inwards in this direction. So this inward indentation, or bulging of the ectoderm, produces this structure which is called pharyngeal groove, the groove side, or also called pharyngeal clefts. Both the nomenclatures are correct. So on the inside, in the region of loose mesenchyme, on the inside of the pharynx, the endoderm bulges out. This outward bulging of the endoderm produces this depression, which is called pharyngeal pouch. On the outside, this is the lining ectoderm. So in the region of loose mesenchyme, in between two bars of condensed mesenchyme, or in between two pharyngeal arches, these condensed mesenchyme, they make up the pharyngeal arches. Okay? So in between two pharyngeal arches, any two, you have this loose mesenchyme. On the outside, the ectoderm lining these arches. In the region of loose mesenchyme, the ectoderm pushes in or bulges in. And this structure that is formed is called pharyngeal cleft or pharyngeal groove. So on the outside, you have pharyngeal groove. On the inside, you have pharyngeal pouch. And then in between these two, this continues to grow. The pharyngeal groove pushes inwards. The pharyngeal pouch pushes further outwards. And then there comes a time when the pharyngeal groove and the pharyngeal pouch, they come in contact with each other with very little mesenchyme. Mesenchyme okay, but there's very little mesenchyme in between the endoderm of the pharyngeal groove, of the pharyngeal pouch and the ectoderm of the pharyngeal groove. In between, you have very little mesenchyme. This structure is formed, which is called pharyngeal membrane. ये देख लीजिए. This is the yellow is the endoderm lining the pharyngeal pouch. This blue is the ectoderm lining the pharyngeal groove, yeah, pharyngeal cleft. In between, there is some bit of mesenchyme. So this structure, when the endoderm of the groove and the ectoderm, when the endoderm of the pouch, I repeat, when the endoderm of the pouch and ectoderm of the pharyngeal groove, when they come in contact with each other with some bit of mesenchyme, very little mesenchyme in between, this structure that is formed is called pharyngeal membrane. Abhi tak, do you have any questions? Any questions, Vita? Okay, if there are no questions, let's move ahead. You have questions, okay. Pharyngeal membrane, I'll repeat the pharyngeal membrane, okay. ठीक है बेटा, thank you, God bless you मेरे. अच्छा बेटा देखो, चलो I'll use this bigger diagram. This is the inside of the pharynx. Okay? And I told you the inside of the pharynx is lined by endoderm. Okay? Because the foregut, pharynx is the cranial-most part of the foregut. And the foregut was formed by the incorporation of the yolk sac into the, due to head fold, part of the yolk sac got incorporated into the embryo and developed into foregut. और ये जो foregut थे, the cranial most part of the foregut was the pharynx. So on the inside of the pharynx, you have a lining of endoderm. On the outside, you have a lining of ectoderm. And in between, you have this mesenchyme. Okay, so together, this is the pharyngeal arch. And I told you, if you spread your fingers are condensed mesenchyme that form the pharyngeal arches. And in between your fingers, you have gaps. These gaps, imagine करें, they are loose mesenchyme. So you have condensed mesenchyme followed by loose mesenchyme, then condensed mesenchyme, then in that particular order. Okay? But whatever there is, on the inside you have endoderm all over, be it condensed mesenchyme or loose mesenchyme. In between is condensed mesenchyme, in between you have loose mesenchyme. Whatever the structure may be, on the inside it is lined by endoderm of the pharynx. On the outside, you have a lining of ectoderm. And then comes mesenchyme or mesoderm in between the ectoderm, endoderm. Okay? This loose mesenchyme, I told you, in the region of loose mesenchyme over here, the endoderm of the pharynx that bulges out. It is bulging out. And this structure that is formed by the bulging out of the endoderm is called pharyngeal pouch. Here, pharyngeal pouch formed by the bulging out of the endoderm of the pharynx. On the outside, the ectoderm in the region of loose mesenchyme. Loose है ना, जहाँ मर्जी push कर लो. So from the outside, this ectoderm pushes inwards. This structure that is formed, a groove-like structure that is formed, this is called pharyngeal groove, या pharyngeal cleft. So on the inside, you have a pharyngeal pouch. On the outside, you have a pharyngeal groove. अब ये दोनों जो हैं structures, groove पे, pouch पे, they are in the region of loose mesenchyme. Loose में से ही groove या pouch बनेगी ना बेटा. Condensed mesenchyme में तो ना groove बनता है, वो तो एक solid structure है. ये, this is the pharyngeal pouch. Okay? So as the grooves and the pouches deepen, they approach each other, so that they come in contact with each other. So ectoderm of the groove comes in contact with the endoderm of the pouch with very little mesenchyme in between, very little loose mesenchyme in between. This structure together make up the pharyngeal membrane. ये देख लीजिए, ये आपका ओरिजिनल था. Ectoderm of the groove, endoderm of the pouch with very little mesenchyme in between. This structure is the pharyngeal membrane. Gee, do we have any other questions, Peter? Do we move ahead? Okay, I guess we do. जी, अब बताइए. Oh, thank you, my dear. Thank you very much. God bless you. Let's move ahead. अच्छा जी, अब components of the pharyngeal arches. देखो बेटा, ये pharyngeal arch है, solid part, condensed mesenchyme. It has 4 components. Every arch has its own skeletal component. By skeletal component, I mean it can either be a cartilage or it can be a bone. So every arch has its own cartilage or bone, or both, or none. बने तो थे लेकिन later on जाके degenerate कर गए. But to begin with, yes, it has a skeletal component, which could be a cartilage or a bone. The second structure that develops inside the pharyngeal arch is a muscle, striated muscle. Yes, smooth muscles नहीं होंगे यहाँ पे. It will be a striated muscle. अब ये muscles जो हैं, they may subdivide. It can be a single muscle or it may subdivide into multiple small muscles. But whatever the case may be, it is always supplied by the nerve of the arch, because every arch has its own nerve, which is a cranial nerve. Every arch has its own blood vessel. This is the blood vessel, artery of the arch. This is the nerve of the arch. This is a skeletal component, and this is the striated muscle. Okay? So you have four structures there. So the striated muscle, it may be divided into smaller, multiple, or whatever the case may be, it is supplied by the nerve of the arch. And wherever these muscles go, they always take their nerves with them. So अगर ये एक इसका classical example जो है, that is the diaphragm, that develops in the cervical region, लेकिन it goes down into the thorax. And in the cervical region, it is supplied by the phrenic nerve, C345. But जब it descends into the thorax, it takes its nerve with it. Okay? So wherever these muscles go, they take the nerve supply with them. अब आ जाते हैं arterial component. Arterial component उसका जो है arterial arch होता है. Sorry, artery of the pharyngeal arch. So pharyngeal arch artery जो है, that joins two structures. ये आपकी arteries of the pharyngeal arches है. They join the aortic sac to the dorsal aorta. ये देख लीजिए. This is the aortic sac, and it is joining with these arteries are the pharyngeal arch arteries, joining the aortic sac to the dorsal aorta. One artery for every arch. Okay? Achha. The fourth component is the nerve of the arch. Remember, ये nerve जो है, it's always a cranial nerve. The nerve of the pharyngeal arch is a cranial nerve. अब this cranial nerve supplies muscles. It also supplies sensory branches. Sensory branches connective tissue of dermis के लिए होती हैं. The rest is the supply to the muscles. कौन से muscles? Muscles of the pharyngeal arch. The pharyngeal arch muscles we just discussed a few seconds ago. Pharyngeal arch muscles are supplied by the nerve of the arch, of the same arch. Third pharyngeal nerve, third pharyngeal arch का जो muscle है, it will be supplied by the nerve of the third arch. ये नहीं होगा कि third pharyngeal arch का muscle है, nerve supply second से आ रही है, ऐसा नहीं होगा. जो arch है number, उसका जो muscle है वो उसी arch की nerve से supply हो. Okay, so ये एक basic concept था. So far, are you clear about it? Is there anything that I can repeat for you? Achha. So it seems that you are all clear about this. That's good. अच्छा जी, अब thing to remember is कि जो pharyngeal arches हैं, they contribute extensively to the formation of structures of head and neck, larynx, pharynx, nose, everything, face, palate, everything is formed by the pharyngeal arches. अब first तो आपको मैंने बता दी. I told you every arch has its own 4 components, namely the skeletal muscle, skeletal component है, muscle component है, it has its own artery and has its own nerve. Now, what happens is कि ये जो second arch है ना, this is the first arch. This is the first membrane. ठीक है? This is the second arch. The second arch, it begins to grow caudally. ये देख लीजिए, it is growing down inferiorly. It grows caudally. ठीक है? अब अगर मैं enumerate करूँ तो this is the first arch, second arch, third arch, fourth arch, fifth arch. अच्छा एक बात याद रखिए, एक तो मैंने आपको बताया था कि ये जो arches हैं, they develop in the start mesenchyme, neural crest mesenchyme to travels in the region of the developing pharyngeal arches third week. But these arches begin to appear in the fourth week. They appear as solid rods on the side wall of the pharynx. ये मैंने आपको बताया है. Craniocaudal जो है systematically appear करती हैं, the first one, then the second, third, fourth. So craniocaudal sequence में ये appear करती हैं. The first 3 are very, in fact, first 4 are very obvious. Fifth वाली rudimentary होती है, sixth वाली भी कोई खास elevation produce नहीं करती, but yes, it is there. First 3 produce a very prominent elevation on the side wall of the pharynx. So this is the first, second, third, fourth arch, pharyngeal arch. Second को देख लीजिए, the second arch begins to grow caudally. ठीक है? In such a way that it overlaps the third and the fourth arch. Now, this second arch is growing down towards the cardiac eminence. यहाँ पे ये cardiac eminence है. This is the fourth arch. Okay. अब as the second arch is growing down, it is growing caudally. As the second arch is growing caudally, ये जो third and fourth arch हैं, ये देख लीजिए, they are lying, they come to lie in a depression. ये एक clefts या depression सा produce हो गया, जिसमें दोनों बेचारी arches पड़ी हुई हैं, third and fourth, being overlapped by the second arch. Okay. अब ये जो depressions produced because of overlapping of the second arch, third and fourth arch are being overlapped by the second, so that the third and fourth arch are lying in this depression or a cleft. This depression or cleft in which the third and fourth arch are lying, this is called cervical sinus. ये जो है cervical sinus. और ये देख लीजिए, ये जो cervical sinus है, this is connected to the exterior. Close नहीं है, this is connected to the exterior. But then ultimately, in 6th week में जाके ये जो second arch है, which is growing caudally, this second arch grows further caudally and then ultimately fuses with the cardiac eminence. ये cardiac eminence है, अभी तक cervical sinus है. Then it goes, the second arch as it is growing caudally, it goes and fuses with the cardiac eminence. अब ये जो cervical sinus था. This then disappears, and by the 7th week the neck becomes smooth. ये देख लीजिए. The neck has become a smooth structure. अभी तक ये देख लीजिए elevations की. अब ऊपर सिर्फ elevation रह गई है. Lower down a smooth structure is formed. बस thing to remember is कि ये जो cleft या gap है between the surface and the third and fourth, जिसको हम cervical sinus कहते हैं, ये it remains for a while, for a couple of weeks, so and then it disappears. Okay? So the cervical sinus ultimately disappears. Okay, Jay. Before we go any further, are you clear about all this so far? Because now we begin to discuss structures that develop from these arches. So are we clear about all this? Okay, it seems there are no questions. Up, let's do the first arch first. Okay, we'll do all this. We'll do the skeletal component of the arch. We'll do the muscles of the arch. We will do the nerve of the arch, and we will do the artery of the arch. आपकी किताब में पहले सारे skeletal components दिए हुए हैं, उसके बाद सारे muscles दिए हुए हैं, then nerves, and finally the arteries all together. लेकिन I will not be doing that. I will do one arch with all its components at one time. अच्छा जी, first arch जो है, first arch divides, has two prominences. I mean, you could say it splits into two. ये two prominences जो है, एक maxillary prominence है, एक mandibular prominence है. ठीक है? Maxillary prominence, ये देख लीजिए. This is the developing brain. Over here would be the eyes. So the maxillary prominence is under the eyes, and this is the mandibular prominence here. And between the two maxillary prominence, this is the oropharyngeal membrane, which is now beginning to rupture. ये देख लीजिए, ये prominence जो है, this all is the first arch. ये सारी, ये developing heart है. This is the first arch. ये इसका maxillary prominence है, ये mandibular prominence है. Between the two, you have the oropharyngeal membrane. अच्छा, अब first arch का जो skeletal muscle component की बात करते हैं, cartilage of the first arch. Skeletal muscle, skeletal component, skeletal muscle नहीं बेटा, skeletal component. मैंने बताया था skeletal component में या bone होगा या cartilage होगी. So the cartilage of the first arch is Meckel's cartilage. Meckel's cartilage develop करता है into mandible, and then of course you have chordate cartilage भी एक होती है जो कि face के bones में develop करती है. But remember your Meckel's cartilage given in every book, that develops into mandible. अब देखते हैं कि first arch की cartilage से what does develop in from first arch cartilage. ये देख लीजिए, this is the developing head and neck. अब ये जो Meckel's cartilage है ना, this is how it is lying here. So this would be the dorsal end of the Meckel's cartilage, and this is the ventral end of this cartilage. ये सारी cartilage है, dorsal end और Meckel's cartilage का ये ventral end. So dorsal end से अगर हम शुरू करें, the dorsal end पे it develops parts of the pieces of cartilage, they break up. ठीक है? Pieces of cartilage from the dorsal end, they break up. ये जो small pieces of cartilage that have broken away from this Meckel's cartilage, they develop into bones of the middle ear cavity. Air की bones, middle ear cavity की दो bones, incus और malleus. Middle part of the cartilage जो है that regress कर जाता है, degenerate कर जाता है, लेकिन the perichondrium of the cartilage that persists, and the perichondrium of this Meckel's cartilage, this develops into this structure, anterior ligament of the malleus. ये malleus है ना, ये उसका anterior ligament of the malleus, and then you have this sphenomandibular ligament. This is the spine of the sphenoid bone spine, and this is the sphenomandibular ligament. Excuse me. I repeat once again. Dorsal end से शुरू करें cartilage का. The dorsal end of the cartilage that breaks into these small broken pieces of the cartilage posteriorly, they develop into two bones of the middle ear cavity, कान की दो bones, incus and malleus. So dorsal end develops into incus and malleus. The middle part of this Meckel's cartilage, this degenerates. लेकिन इसकी perichondrium persist करती है, and this perichondrium develops into anterior ligament of the malleus. So this is the anterior ligament of the malleus. This ligament connects to the malleus. Malleus is the bone of the middle ear cavity. And the other rest of the perichondrium, this develops into sphenomandibular ligament. Sphenomandibular meaning it at one end, this is the spine of the sphenoid bone. At one end, it is attached to the spine of the sphenoid. At the other end, it is attached to the mandible. जब आपने mandible की sphenomandibular ligament, मैंने आपको ये खुद पढ़ाए थे जब मैंने TMJ आपको करवाया था. ठीक है? So this is the sphenomandibular ligament. अब आ जाते हैं ventral end. Here, this is the ventral end of the Meckel's cartilage. ये जो ventral end है ना, this basically forms a base around which the mandible is formed. ये जो mesenchyme surrounding around this cartilage, anterior end of the Meckel's cartilage. ये सारी Meckel's cartilage थी ना, ये all this was Meckel's cartilage. इसका जो ventral end है, the mesenchyme around this mesenchyme surrounding this Meckel's cartilage, this develops into the primordium of the mandible, and then this mandible develops by intramembranous ossification. आपको पता है, ठीक है? Mandible develops by intramembranous ossification. When the mandible has developed, then this cartilage degenerates and disappears. इस cartilage का basically purpose ये था कि it actually serves as a guide around which the mesenchyme is formed and ossified to develop into mandible. Right half, left half, and the two halves of the mandible, they fuse in the midline. So right side पे भी cartilage है, left side पे भी cartilage है, and they fuse in the midline. अच्छी चीज तो हमने कहा था कि इसका एक maxillary process है, first arch का एक mandibular process है. Mandibular process तो आपको बता दिया कि हमने mandible कर ली थी. Maxillary process से क्या develop होता है, आपको बताया था कि जो mesenchyme है उससे quadrate cartilage होती है, but this quadrate cartilage disappears. Structures क्या develop होते हैं from the maxillary process. यहाँ से शुरू कर देते हैं. Over here you have the premaxilla. This is the maxilla. Then comes the zygomatic bone, and this is the temporal bone. हमने जब ये bones discuss की थी, I told you the temporal bone begins to develop. अब ये सब bones एक तो ये है कि they develop by intramembranous ossification. ये हमने पहले डिस्कस किया था, and I told you the temporal bone begins to develop as a bone of the face, but then later on it is withdrawn, drawn backwards, and it becomes part of the bone of the skull. Okay, developmentally it begins to develop, the temporal bone begins to develop as bone of the face, but then later on it is drawn backwards and comes to be part of the skull. अब ये देख लीजिए कि all these bones, maxilla, zygomatic bone, temporal bone, all these developed by intramembranous ossification. The mandible developed by intramembranous ossification. So the first arch के जो bones हैं, they all developed by intramembranous ossification. और हम ये पहले ही discuss कर चुके हैं कि intramembranous ossification उन bones में होती है जिनमें you need early support. clavicle आपके axial और appendicular skeleton के दरमियान communication बनाता है, provides support to the appendicular skeleton. इसी तरह हमने डिस्कस किया था skull की जब डेवलपमेंट की थी कि the protective case that protect the bone, आपकी ये जो calvaria के जो bones थी, temporal, parietal, occipital, all these developed by intramembranous ossification. जो base of the skull की bones थी वो cartilage थे, intracartilaginous. अब these bones provides support and protection to the face and whatever is inside the head and neck. So that is why, since these bones provide protection and some bit of support to the face, that is why they develop early and they develop by intramembranous ossification. Is this clear? Okay, let's move ahead. Muscles of the arch. Muscles of the arch में you have muscles of mastication. 4 muscles of mastication: masseter, temporalis, and then lateral and medial pterygoid. वो यहाँ पे नहीं दिखाए हुए. So this yellow में you have 4 muscles of mastication. उसके अलावा please follow this yellow color. ठीक है? So it is ये landline की drawing है. इससे पहले अभी तक जितनी भी थी वो KLM की drawings थी. You also have the anterior belly of the digastric muscle. ये digastric muscle है. So anterior belly of this is the mylohyoid. ये anterior belly of the digastric. Then of course you have tensor palatii, palatum muscle है, and tensor tympani. ये mid layer cavity का muscle है. All these are muscles of the first arch, developed from the first arch. Nerve of the first arch. Remember, nerve of the first arch is the 5th cranial nerve. Basically, it is the mandibular nerve. The nerve of the first arch is the mandibular nerve. Mandibular आपको याद है trigeminal nerve की branch थी, and it was a branch of the trigeminal nerve that had both motor भी component था उसका, sensory component भी था. ठीक है? That is why the mandibular nerve was said to be a mixed component of the 5th cranial nerve. The other 2 components, namely the maxillary and the ophthalmic, they are the purely sensory components of this nerve, 5th cranial nerve. लेकिन mandibular component muscles भी supply करती है और sensory innervation भी. Now it supplies all the muscles of the first arch. Let's go back. अगर आपको याद हो, your muscles of mastication are supplied by mandibular nerve. ठीक है? Masseter, temporalis, lateral and medial pterygoid. All these are supplied by mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. बाकी anterior belly of digastric We'll do that later on. Then comes the nerve of the fur. ठीक है ना? Mandibular हमने discuss कर ली. Mandibular mixed nerve है. It also gives sensory branches. It also gives sensory fibers. Sensory fibers किसको देती है? It gives sensory fibers to the dermis and connective tissue. ठीक है? So अब ये जो sensory innervation है, this is also contributed by the maxillary division of the brain. So maxillary division only supplies sensory component, dermis of the face, etc. अब ये supply क्या करती है? ये supply करती है face को, teeth, mucous membrane, the gums, etc. All these are supplied by the gums, nose, nasal cavity, mouth, etc. All this is supplied by the sensory supply is either partly from the mandibular and partly from maxillary. लेकिन जो इसका motor supply है, that means muscles हैं, that are only supplied by the mandibular. But it will be safe if you just remember कि first arch की जो nerve है, that is the mandibular division of trigeminal. खाली trigeminal याद मत कहिएगा, because trigeminal के 3 components हैं, जिसमें से thalamic की कोई contribution नहीं है. So please just be sure कि use the word mandibular nerve. Okay? The first nerve of the first arch is the mandibular nerve. और supply मैंने आपको बता दी है. Face, teeth, mucous membranes कहाँ की? Nose, mouth, tongue, nasal cavity, oral cavity, etc. ये सब mucous membranes को supply करती है. अच्छा जी, अभी तक do we have any questions before I move on to the next arch? We still have 5 minutes. So do we have any questions? I guess not. Okay. No, man. Thank you, my dear. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gaurav. आगे चलते हैं. That means this is clear and this is really heartening. ठीक है? Because ये थोड़ा सा मुश्किल हो जाता है. A little tricky. Head and neck की development जो है. This is something that you have to memorize. First arch के components क्या हैं? हर component से क्या बनता है? जो skeletal component है, उससे cartilage के आगे से subdivisions उससे क्या बनता है? Muscles component उससे क्या? Muscles कौन से develop होते हैं? क्योंकि ये आपके MCQs भी आते हैं. The nerve of the first arch is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Muscles developing from the first arch is muscles developing from the second arch. ये आपको इसी तरह ही memorize करना है बेटा. ठीक है? So आप लोगों की तो माशाल्लाह memory बहुत अच्छी है. You people, I mean, are in a habit of memorizing all your MCQs and everything. सब कुछ कर लेते हो ना? हर चीज, हर स्टेम आपको एक लाइन आपको याद होती है. इसलिए तो you are not doing well in your MCQs over here because यहाँ पे हम word to word किताब से तो लेते नहीं है, क्योंकि एक किताब से तो MCQs बनते ही नहीं है. अच्छा जी, next arch पे चलते हैं. I'll just give you a broad overview because the time is almost over. So एक quick. अच्छा हाँ, sorry, artery तो इस arch की रह गई. The fourth component is the artery of the arch. हमने cartilage component किया था and bones. We have done the muscle component. This is skeletal muscle developed होता है. We've done the nerve of the arch. Now comes the artery of the arch. आर्टरी का हमने डिस्कस किया था ना बेटा कि आर्टरी जो है आर्च की, दैट इज joins the arterial pharyngeal arteries जो हैं, they join the aortic sac to the dorsal aorta. Okay. This is first arch, second arch, third arch, fourth, fifth and sixth. First arch की जो artery है, that is the maxillary artery. Some books also mention कि external carotid है, लेकिन maxillary हर किताब mention करती है. So remember, the maxillary artery develops from the first arch. The rest of the arch regresses. Okay. So just one artery from the first arch, maxillary artery. बाकी सारी हम ये already pharyngeal arch arteries हम कर चुके हैं. ठीक है. So हमने क्या कहा? Only artery that develops from the first arch is the maxillary artery. बस. I think second arch जो है, let's do that day after tomorrow, next time के लिए. ठीक है, इसको नेक्स्ट टाइम के लिए छोड़ देते हैं. चलो एक बेसिक इसमें बात आप याद रख लीजिए. बिल्कुल जिस तरह कार्टिलेज ऑफ द फर्स्ट आर्च को हम नेकल्स कार्टिलेज कहते थे, उसका नाम नेकल्स कार्टिलेज था. सेकंड आर्च की जो कार्टिलेज है, दैट इज कॉल्ड रिचर्स कार्टिलेज. रिचर्स कार्टिलेज. ठीक है. सो दी cartilage of the second arch is called Ritchie's cartilage. अब second arch जो है ये इस dark green में ली हुई है. ये light में जो था grey में ये first arch है. This is the second arch. इसको अभी ना देखें. This is a drawing taken from Lacrimal. ये KLM की drawing है. और ये जो है ना कलर कोड ये KLM से लिया हुआ है. So please have a look at this dark green. Structures formed from dark green. ठीक है. ये अब हमने इंशाल्लाह next time we'll do this. For today we finished. Any question? Anything you want me to repeat? चलो अब तो टाइम हो गया. जो भी questions आपके होंगे आप मुझे next time we can discuss them. Okay? Chalo. Thank you very much. God bless. Enjoy your lectures.